Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. My name is John Kiff, or I go by the name Kiffmeister on social media. That's where you'll find me. And I'm research director at the Sovereign Official Digital Association, or SODA for short. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome all of you to the second edition of the DC3 conference, From Cryptocurrencies to CBDCs. It's organized by the ITU in collaboration with the Future of Digital Currency Initiative of Stanford University as part of the activities of the Digital Currency Global Initiative, or DC³. The DC³ was set up in 2020 following the conclusion of the ITU-T focus group on digital currency, including digital fiat currency. The DC3 conference aims to highlight the work of the DC³ with a spotlight on emerging trends, innovations, technical standards, and initiatives shaping the future of digital currencies and financial inclusion. There are three working groups established by the ITU under the DC³. They are the policy and governance, architecture, interoperability and use cases, and security and assurance. The work on offline transactions for CBDCs is being discussed in the CBDC work stream in the architecture working group. I lead the CBDC work stream under the DC³. Before I invite the panelists for the remarks, I'd like to inform the audience that they can put their questions in the Q&A window, but it's probably better to use the Pigeonhole facility that I think the coordinates for that are in the chat box. That's going to make it easier for us to track feedback and comments and questions that we'll be covering later in the session. So before we move on, I just want to remind you that we did cover the higher level aspects of offline digital currency earlier, a couple of sessions ago. And this session, we're going to go into some of the deeper technical details. In fact, address some of the questions that popped up in this earlier session. And in order of intervention, the panelists are going to be Lauren Giudice, she's a senior architect at Idemia, and Stuart Smith, who's a senior manager, crypto products at Visa. So Lauren, take it away.
Thank you, John. Hello, everyone. Sharing the screen. Is it visible for you?
Yep.
All right, so let me start with the plan I have for you today. So we're going to see in 5 parts what we have as the offline solution today as Idemia. So the first one, we will concentrate a bit about what we call the consecutive offline payments. So I know that it has been covered in previous sessions, but I would like to emphasize quickly the advantages and how we actually make it work offline, what kind of data structure that we exchange offline makes this possible. Then I will go through the 2 main operations in addition to paying offline, the funding and the defunding operations. So this is about talking of converting the online funds we have on online accounts to offline ones, and the opposite operation. And third, I would like to pause a bit and look into the different kind of secure elements we could use for hosting such offline wallets. Then, because we have started this experience for 2 years now, I would like also to give a feedback on the practical experimentation that we have done. So the little tricks, maybe because the devil is always in the details. So some things that I would like to share with everyone that would like to actually enter into this experimentation of offline CBDC. And if we have time, I hope I have 3 different videos. So at least I'm hoping that we could see the first one, showing the offline payment we have between 2 phones, the funding and the defunding operation on one of the ledger we have chosen, and also some additional capabilities like financial aid that we could obtain and load on those offline wallets, and also stimulus payments and controls that we can apply on offline wallets. So moving on to the consecutive offline payments. So we have this ability to convert offline funds and online funds in funding and defunding operation. And we have this ability when we have offline funds to actually respend them to a peer. So it's really a peer-to-peer payment that we propose for offline usage here. And when we receive it offline, we can respend it offline in an unlimited amount, except maybe if the bank want to maybe limit for different security reasons. We also have this ability to accept a payment without any offline wallets. And in that case, that could be, for example, for a merchant, this merchant would need to be able to go back online to be able to respend that payment. So consecutive offline payments, funding and defunding with a ledger. So I'm going to focus on the ledger today because I believe this is a really interesting case. But of course, what we are showing today is also compatible with a centralized server. The financial aid, I talked about it a little. So this is the capacity to load an extra payment that would be given, for example, from your government in a specific period, like the COVID period we have met, and this ability to be able to spend it offline. And then because security is the main focus that we should also keep, we have this ability to apply some controls when we credit or when we debit the balance that we would host on these offline wallets. We support today two forms of offline wallets. So that's going to be in the form of a SIM card, so one secure element that you typically have in your smartphone today. We have this extra capacity also in the SIM cards that we have to embed some biometric features. And we have also another type of offline wallet. This is a chip-based payment card with also biometry, so optionally biometry, based on fingerprint recognition. So why offline payments? I guess this has been answered already, but I need to go back a little. It's because it provides the ability to accept a payment and deliver the goods immediately. So this is what we call the immediate settlement finality. And this is really important if, let's say, you just have a network which is not stable enough or no network at all. The second advantage is this ability to actually decrease the loads on the server side. So if you have this real consecutive offline payments happening aside the online part, it would mean that no added burden would be put on the server side in order to accept and generate a payment. So how does it work? First, if you deliver a wallet, this wallet is not the typical wallet you would use on a decentralized ledger today. This wallet needs to have an additional couple of things that I will describe here. You need to have a balance, and this is where we have the main difference. This hosted balance needs to be secured, and this is really representing the number of tokens, being CBDC or not, that you would actually be able to spend from this wallet. You have additional assets in order to protect against anti-replay attacks. So we have this nonce for Alice here, which is just a counter which increments each time that Alice will pay with her wallet. We have also a key pair. So this is a bit more similar to a typical wallet for going on a decentralized ledger. And this key pair, however, is made of a private and a public key, and the private key would be actually taken private even from its own user. So even Alice doesn't know her private key. Her public key, however, would be, of course, known by anyone who is interested in, and would be, in addition, attested by an authority. So this authority could be centralized or decentralized. So this is where we can see the red key here that has the corresponding private key that actually sign or attest the public key of Alice. So this, in our case of CBDC, could be the central bank, which attests that the wallet delivered to Alice is correct by just signing her public key. The signing could happen in different steps. This could happen in provisioning steps like we have for today for EMV payments, or this could also happen later on the field if, let's say, we want to generate the key pair later on, only when Alice would have provided her biometric fingerprint, for example. So with this wallet, what I call this offline wallet, Alice would be able to pay another peer offline, who is Bob here. So if Alice wants to spend one CBDC and pay Bob, who also has his own wallet here, Alice will generate a payment, and we propose to have this couple of fields injected into the sealed transaction. When I say sealed, that means that we will sign the content, and this content would be exactly signed by the private key, which was kept secure by this offline wallet. And along this signed transaction, Alice would also send her attestation to the payee so that the payee would be able to check the validity of the payment. So in this simple example of Alice paying Bob, the amount has been sealed in the transaction, but also Alice's public key, so the emitter of the payment, the recipient of the payment, so Bob's public key, and we added this special anti-replay counter here, which will increment after the first generated payment would be done. So Alice sent this content to Bob, and Bob can check that indeed, because the attestation is correct on the public key shipped by Alice, this is a legitimate offline wallet. It has the right amount that was expected by Bob, and this is indeed for Bob. Also, what is really important is to make sure that Alice has not sent the same transaction before. And for that, Bob would be responsible to check that this anti-replay counter that was used in this transaction was not already met in a previous transaction from Alice. And only then the offline wallet from Bob would be able to increment its balance in order to be able to respend it later. So that's the same. It's like a full chain, even though we don't store every thing that happened in the chain in the transaction. If, for example, Bob wants to be able to respend that payment and pays Carol, Bob will just reseal a transaction using his offline wallet. This time, the emitter would be Bob's public key. The recipient would be Carol's public key here, and he will also attach his own anti-replay counter. The wallet would sign everything, would also ship his attestation to Carol. Carol has no offline wallet. She has no secure element either, but she can check the full payment because it's using asymmetric cryptography. So now we can wonder about the missing steps here, how we actually fund the wallet with this initial offline balance, and how we are able also for Carol to respend that amount that she received offline when she would go back online. So online, what do we have, for example, for being able to fund the wallet? So we have two smart contracts. The first one here is just an example for us to show that we are able to store different accounts online. And because we were using Ethereum for this experience, we just based our first smart contract hosting the balances online on the ERC20 standard. So it's just a couple of online accounts, and one of them is actually corresponding to an account which we call the escrow account, and its address corresponds to the deployed smart contract checker here. That means that he's the only one who would be able to actually transfer some funds from this account to someone else. This is important for the defunding later on. So all smart contracts do know about the public key that was used to attest every offline wallet, so that when they want to check any submitted payment, they are able to check and apply the same checks that Bob did before. So this is what we have online, and we can look here at the full funding experience that Bob could have when he, for example, received some payment from Alice. When he wants to receive some payment from his bank. So Bob has this offline wallet provided with a key pair, optionally having his biometric fingerprint, and he will request a free CBDC from his bank accounts using an intermediary, which we called a payment interface provider or payment service provider, and it will possibly be a decentralized application or not, but this is basically a web portal where Bob would be able to enter the amount, enter his online account, and wait for the transaction that would be generated by his bank and send it back in order to fund his wallet. So in the second step, his bank would receive the request from Bob. So if we are using decentralized technology, we can use an oracle for that. And Bob transaction would be generated by this bank. And also an additional operation would consist of transferring the same amount that was claimed by Bob into the famous escrow account that we have talked about. So if it's 3 CBDCs generated for Bob as a payment transaction, and it looks really the same as we have seen for Alice and Bob, then the escrow account would be also receiving the 3 CBDCs. In that case, the transaction could just be fetched back from the ledger or could be sent directly to Bob. It really depends on the web portal we have here. Of course, if we want to fund Bob's wallet and we have no opportunity to have a bank account or any service provider which could help us, we could have this opportunity to directly fetch the content on the ledger if, let's say, the emitter would not necessarily be a bank or would be another person. So if when we say Alice can pay Bob offline, Alice can also send the content online. And it doesn't matter if everybody is seeing the content. Anyone could not actually use the payment that would be generated by Alice. Only Bob could be able to spend that payment. So I'm not talking about privacy here, but I'm just talking about a functionality where you can actually send some payment, and that payment could be fetched anytime from the ledger. Then how about the opposite operation? So we have Alice paying Bob. Bob has paid Carol. Carol has no secure element. So now she wants to be able to spend the payment received by Bob. So she will use the smart contract checker this time. So she will send Bob's payment online. Again, she can use a decentralized application or her web portal in order to do that. And she just directly sends it to the smart contract checker. The smart contract checker will check everything, the signature, the emitter is attested, and so on. And we'll remember the different anti-replay counters that would be needed in case Carol would just resubmit the same payment again in order to maybe fraud. When the smart contract checker checks everything and everything is correct, only then it would be able to take some funds from the escrow account that was initially funded and transfer this amount, right up to Carol's balance. In more details, and this is where we can see that we are a bit ledger agnostic. We have Bob's payment here that was generated. And this was the typical generation that it would have done for Carol if she was online or offline. It doesn't really matter at this step. Then, because Carol is using a decentralized ledger like Ethereum here, she can just encapsulate the full payment into an Ethereum transaction. And the different fields of this Ethereum transaction would really depend on the ledger itself. But at least we have one field that is shipping the total payment that was received offline. So for example, in Ethereum, we have the emitter being Carol, we have the recipient being the smart contract checker, and we have a different anti-replay counter for Carol because this is really her online account. She has no offline wallet. So it means that if, for example, I wanted to ship that content into a UTXO-based ledger, it wouldn't really matter because in the end, it's not the content of the ledger transaction which matters. It's really the content that would be decapsulated by the ledger and sent to the smart contract that we want to use in order to check everything. So at least what we need to have on the ledger side, being centralized or not, is a kind of programmability in order to check the different signatures. We would need also to store the anti-replay counters that we have received, and each time we accept a payment for defunding, so converting offline payment to online accounts, then we would be able to check that this payment has not been submitted already in the past. So it's important that between the offline wallets and this service that we have for defunding, we speak the same cryptographic language. If the card or the offline wallet, more generically speaking, is signing something with a specific elliptic curve, a specific version of hashing, it's important that the service has the same one in order to verify everything. So in the end, we don't really matter because there were a lot of discussions about being account-based or token-based. In our case with this protocol, we don't really see any point to discuss the differences because in the end, we can encapsulate the offline payment transaction into whatever the ledger needs to be able to understand it. So some example of the frauds we could have in this protocol as it is. If let's say Bob wanted to fraud and he wanted to take the payment given by Alice, credit his offline balance onto his offline wallet, but also use the web service for defunding. So in that case, he would be able to double its income. So one being credited on its offline wallet and one being accepted on the ledger as the defunding service by the smart contract checker. And in that case, he would have one CBDC given to his online account, and the public key used here as the address of his account will be the one he used when he generated a payment for himself. And here, the offline wallet would accept everything because the payment even generated by Alice or by Bob himself would be correct. So it's an easy way to actually double the income. So how can we protect against it? Well, first you need to know that because Bob has no idea of what is the private key corresponding to his public key on the offline wallet. If he used the offline wallet to generate a payment for himself and try to defund it, in that case, he cannot reuse the payment that was actually sent to him on his online account. Because remember, we need to have the private key in order to send a transaction from this smart contract to send some funds to another account. So he cannot indeed spend that payment. But the escrow balance would not be good because so far, we could say that the escrow account would represent the total amount of CBDC that were given offline. So it was a kind of safety belt, but it's no longer accurate. So it cannot really use the money, but it has made the system not consistent. So to be able to prevent that, we could just inject an additional field in the sealed transaction when Bob, for example, wants to be able, there's a couple of mistakes here, to be able to spend it. And we can force the intention to be added into this transaction. So if Bob wants to generate a transaction for himself, he will inject a marker saying this is a transaction for redeeming online. And if he wanted a payment from Alice, it will indicate to Alice, okay, but this transaction would be for actually using offline. So by having this specific marker inside the sealed transaction, we can prevent to have a double income, one that would be accepted by the offline wallet and one that would be accepted by the smart contract checker. So it's interesting to see that just by adding some fields in the payment, we can bind the usage of this payment. And it introduces some kind of programmability that would be actually interesting, for example, for binding the payment to specific merchants. So that would be the case for a stimulus payment. So as usual, the full transaction would be signed by the offline wallet private key and sent with the attestation. So I explained a bit how we can protect against replay, but in more details, this is the case where Alice wants to spend some amount to Bob, and she tries to just resend the same transaction. This is what we call the replay, exactly the same transaction. So every field that you would have seen in the transaction before would be the same, and she just resubmits the same thing to Bob. So will Bob offline wallet accept it? So the answer would be no, as long as Bob's wallet would remember the previous anti-replay counter that were sent by Alice. So the table that would be remembered by Bob wallet would look like this. Alice has sent me something and her nonce is a 1 for the moment. If Alice sends something with a nonce that would be different than this one, so this is why we chose an order and not a random here, it would save us from actually saving a lot of historic. Then in that case, I would accept the payment if it is above this value exactly. How about double spending? Sometimes we make the differences between replay and double spending. So here it would mean, for example, that Alice sends the same token, the same funds twice with the same anti-replay counter, but possibly with different recipients or different amount. So in our case, remember that Alice has no access to her private keys. So it means that she cannot actually generate her own transaction and bypass the offline wallets. And the sequence of operations that are actually done by this offline wallet is made of a different operation that are performed atomically. So either everything is performed completely or nothing at all. So it means that when Alice generates an offline payment, she needs to sign this new payment. She needs to decrement the balance, increment her anti-replay counter, and remember the latest payment if, let's say, the payment got lost during the transmission and she wants to be able to resubmit it without decrementing this time the balance. So we can see here, by the way, that it's important to have everything consistent. We cannot accept a power cut in the middle and have only the middle of operations, a part of the operations done. We really need to have this atomic way of executing a sequence of operations. So this is called transactions, by the way. So I talked about the fact that we host secure assets in the wallet, particularly this offline balance. And it's important for that to be able to make sure that this offline wallet is secure enough. So the motivation would be really high. Usually when we talk about money, we assume that the attacker would make a lot of efforts in order to be able to attack the content and change what has been generated or just extract the different private keys in order to generate his own payment, for example. So I'm just quoting here the different type of attacks that we could meet on a typical smart card today as a payment. So usually we are well aware of software attacks, so attacks on the protocol itself, but we need to know also about the existence of hardware attacks. So when you're really motivated, you're doing your best and you use every equipment possible in order to understand what's happening on the execution when, for example, you generate a payment and you're really motivated to extract information in the end to get the SYNCRAL, this is the private key. So in our case, we need to protect the balance, but also the anti-replay counter and this private key, otherwise I could just generate some money out of nothing. So the different attacks here are really some of them are really easy to do and others are really quite complicated. For example, there are some electromagnetic emanation during an operation of signatures. And if you're not careful enough in your implementation, and if you don't have the different countermeasures on your hardware secure element, then you may in the end guess what is the private key that was used. So the private key, the signature is something you need to protect, but also the different step in it. And for example, one of them is a generation of random numbers. So we imagine what would be the different secure elements that we could use. So I won't talk about a non-secure one because to me it wouldn't make sense, even though the programmability is really good. Programmability here is really the availability of different APIs, different cryptography that you need to use in order to apply such protocol. So we have, however, some other secure element or secure solutions that we call the trusted execution environment. So those are really good for some use cases, but this one to me would not be applicable for this. again, we are really motivated by actually extracting the different assets in order to create some money. So trusted execution environment, it's a public knowledge, even published by ARM here and by Intel. They do not protect against hardware attacks. So the typical attacks that I quoted in the previous slides would not be countered by any trusted execution environment that I know about. However, we have other secure elements, which I would group as tamper-resistant elements, which are able to protect from hardware attacks and software attacks. So in terms of security, they are better, but they are sometimes more limited depending on the form factor and the different standards that you would choose. So we have, for example, the tamper-resistant element from Apple, from Qualcomm, from Samsung. So all of those are really interesting. In terms of security, they vary a lot, but some of them have passed certifications, which is usually proof of better quality. But again, the devil is in the details, and you need to look into those secure certification and make sure that everything would be covered for your usage. So for the moment, I would say the security would be quite good on those tamper-resistant elements. However, for the programmability part, they appear to be limited and not fit in for our experimentation that we started first on Ethereum. For example, the elliptic curve that was needed to recover the signer of the transaction was not available in those tamper-resistant elements. So in the end, we opted for the smart cards and the SIM cards because they have already some standards to welcome new applications. They have standards to provide new curves for elliptic cryptography. So they fitted well in terms of programmability. And in terms of security, if you choose to have the highest security for our usage, a lot of them were actually available already. So I'm going to skip that. I don't think we have enough time. This is about showing the different architecture elements which explain why it's more difficult on a trusted execution environment to protect against hardware attacks. So when you share different parts of the architecture, physically speaking, it's always difficult and you are more open to attacks. So you increase your surface of attacks if you share some part of the physical architecture with the non-secure execution environment. Just a reminder in terms of security, I mentioned it at the beginning, but in this solution, the payer needs to have a secure element because it needs to host a secure balance from which it would generate a new payment. But as the payee, you would not need to have a secure element. It's based on asymmetric cryptography. You can check everything. You can accept the payment, deliver the good immediately. And then later on, by the end of the week, of the day, you can actually defund your payment in order to respend it. So a feedback on the practical experimentation that we did. Usually, we opted for different type of communication. So we have QR codes, which was a good way to actually exchange a payment. It would be a limitation if, let's say, you want to have simple or mutual authentication. So simple authentication could be possible, but it would make the whole, I believe, the whole protocol synchronous, which is a bit less convenient. And mutual authentication, if you use QR code, you would end up by having something like 6 QR codes to exchange between the payer and the payee, which is, to me, a highest friction if you want to support this kind of peer-to-peer payment. So usually when someone says we have CBDC offline payment using QR codes and we apply mutual authentication, this looks a bit suspicious. The size of the QR codes is really something that we should take care of, especially when we will try to standardize this protocol. So if we manage to converge to a common protocol And if we decide to have QR codes, those QR codes need to be small in terms of size. So in general, the data exchange between the payer and the payee needs to be limited. If you have a too complex QR code, it's difficult to scan. And even though this is in theory, this QR code could accept a lot of data, we have seen that when we were using webcams from laptops, this could become quite difficult to actually scan it. So we opted for an encoding for the transformation of data before actually being able to show the QR code, which would make the whole thing smaller. So this is a typical encoding that could be part of a standard later on. And we have seen that for the moment, it was not used for the QR codes used for vaccine passports, for example, or the QR code used for EMV. So I guess this is a point of friction that we should discuss. Communication with BLE, we have tested it as well. Although between phones, it seems okay. Between a phone and a laptop, for example, it was quite experimental. So the, the technology stack that we were using was often crashing. So we tried different approaches, but in the end, it was not that stable. So we actually dropped it for the moment, and we really preferred the QR codes. NFC communication, it's something that we are really interested in. So we have this support with the biometric fingerprint cards that we have, that you will see in the demo. But we need to take care about the location when you put actually your card behind your phone. So depending on the quality of the phone, the field would be powerful enough or not, and you may have some troubles to get the data. So our experimentation with the highest smart phones were really good. However, if you try to target a feature phone, if you try to target an old phone, this could become more difficult. So I think we have time for one video. This is a video showing a typical peer-to-peer payment, and first the funding and later on the defunding operation. I'm trying to actually play it. Yes. So this experimentation was done not on Ethereum this time. This is using a hash graph. So it's a variation of a blockchain. And the name was Hedera hash graph. So here we have the funding service, which is hosted by a tablet at the bank, for example. And by inserting the fingerprint card using the contact mode here, we are able to connect with the ledger to escrow the equivalent of the amount that was requested onto the escrow smart contract, and then to sign the amount and send it to the card for the user. Then we have, once we have funded this card, we can actually pay offline using the smart card, and the smart card will generate some funds. So this is a pay-initiated payment that we are seeing here. We tap this NFC smart card on the phone by putting our finger on the sensor. So we authenticate, we generate a payment, and we send it to the SIM card located inside the phone. So this phone is able to host an offline balance because it has a SIM card. Now we have the merchant who has no secure element, who asks for a payment here. So this QR code shows how much he wants to actually be paid. And we have our smartphone with the SIM card wallet, which is able to scan this QR code to understand the demand. And then be able to ask the SIM card, okay, generate something for this recipient. And because you generate and you accept to pay, you need to authenticate yourself. The authentication, the matching is done inside the SIM card so that we are able to protect the biometric features. Then the SIM card is giving the data to the smartphone generates the QR code, and the merchant is able to scan this payment. So this is the offline part. And as I said, by the end of the day, we can redeem everything. So use the defunding operation to convert what we have received to our online accounts for the merchant so that we are able to respend it online. So here we combine every payment we have received we send it to the smart contract checker. The smart contract checker applies the different cryptographic checks on the payments. He remembers the anti-replay counter, and he contacts the ERC token smart contract to transfer from the escrow account to the merchant's aligned account. And here we can see that indeed the token contract has received the transaction requested by the other contract, so that it is able now, as the merchant, to spend the funds. I will stop here and maybe give the hand to Stuart to present his own solution, which looks also very interesting.
Thanks, Lauren. Over to you, Stuart.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Stuart Smith. I'm a product manager with Visa, focused on CBDCs based out of Washington, DC. Specifically, my areas of interest are retail payment, interoperability, and offline payment of CBDCs. Give me 1 second, I'll get my slides up. Is that coming through okay?
Yep. Good.
Great. Okay, so today I will cover a few topics relating to Visa's explorations of offline payment technologies. First, I'll talk about Visa's history of research into offline payment. Second, I'll do a deep dive on our offline payment system, or OPS research solution. I'll do a quick demo of OPS. Then I'll talk through some lessons learned and controls recommendations we have for offline payment based on our recent experimentation. So to introduce our current solution, I first wanted to talk a little bit about our history of experience with offline payments. First is Visa Cash. So Visa Cash was piloted back in the 1990s as an exploration of allowing users to spend offline without connectivity back to the wider card network. The system used a stored value card that could be loaded at ATMs with cash and then used to transact offline with merchants. Visa Cash held value on the cards themselves and not in an account at an issuing bank, like a debit card model. A number of parallel solutions were developed around the same time, such as Mondex and Octopus Card. Visa Cash was similar to a Metro Fare card that works on a closed-loop network of terminals. The system was never implemented widely, but did lead to a lot of lessons learned. Since our experimentation with Visa Cash, Visa strived to make as many transactions occur online as possible, as this allows for our suite of value-added services to occur, which increase the security and extensibility of transactions on our network. However, fast forward a few years, since 2019 and the renewed interest in offline payments as part of our ongoing engagement with central banks, the Visa Crypto and Visa Research teams have partnered to publish a technical research paper on how offline payment can be conducted in a two-tier infrastructure. This paper had some definitions for how we think of a secure offline payment, and they have the following characteristics. First is offline verifiability. Receiver must be able to independently verify the authenticity of any payment without communicating with the server during the payment. Second, absolute finality. Once a payment is complete, the receiver must be instantly guaranteed to own the transferred funds. Third, online redeemability. A client must be able to convert any amount from their offline balance into their online balance and vice versa. Fourth, offline transitivity. After receiving an offline payment, the receiver must be able to spend the payment amount or a portion of it in the same offline session, i.e., without requiring to go online to redeem the payment amount and then spend it. Fifth is security. Offline payments are considered secure if they have the following properties. No double spending, meaning no malicious client can spend the same money more than once. Wallet security. No malicious client can spend or remove money from an honest client's wallet without their permission. And then finally, supply conservation, which means that the total supply of money in the system always remains the same, and a client can only add or remove money from the system using the deposit and withdraw functionalities provided by the system. So with all of those characteristics in place, we've actually developed a research solution, implementation of what we had in the paper that we call the offline payment system. We received quite a positive response about the initial paper and decided that it would be a good idea to build out this implementation that allows for central banks to test offline payment to inform their decision-making process. Whether a central bank is considering enabling offline functionality in their CBDC issuances, we want to be able to share our findings as well as provide this research solution into their testing. We've tested versions of OPS using both a traditional server-based model of accounts as well as a DLT implementation that uses a smart contract. In the DLT implementation, the smart contract is used to lock funds during the duration of funds being offline. Ultimately, we are agnostic as to the layer 1 solution used to issue the CBDC and would want to be able to support whatever architecture is chosen by a central bank. So today I will do a deep dive on the research implementation of OPS and the different workflows we can enable. So our offline payment system supports the common 2-tier infrastructure favored by many central banks in their exploration of CBDC. In the 2-tier model, the central bank is responsible for issuing CBDC and setting governance. Central bank also serves as the root certificate authority in a public key infrastructure, or PKI. Central bank certifies additional institutions to serve as intermediate CAs. These intermediate CAs have 2 roles. First is to vet wallet providers based on compliance with the regulations set forth by the central bank. The second is the actual issuing of digital certificates to those vetted wallet providers so that they can facilitate CBDC payments securely. Intermediate CAs issue certificates to vetted banks who have the ability to issue wallets to end users. These banks are responsible for KYCing users and ensuring adherence to governance set forth by the central bank around offline payments. The central bank has the ability to require certain controls, which I'll discuss later. However, this model does allow for each bank to implement their own wallet and front end as long as it adheres to the core principles put out by the central bank. The core advantage of this 2-tier model is that it decouples the certificate infrastructure, which is labeled as tier 1, from the critical latency path of payments, labeled as the payment tier on the slide, which allows wallet providers such as banks and other FIs to securely process CBDC payments at a high scale without imposing extra overhead on the highly protected PKI nodes. From the perspective of an end user, we can consider 2 different types of payments, online and offline. So online payments are by far the most common type of payment that happens today. These payments require either or both ends of the payment to communicate with one or more payment providers at the time of payment to verify the availability of funds. In the Visa world, we call that authorization, to ensure the compliance of the transaction with policies and regulations as well. In crypto payments, the users need to communicate with a DLT to both issue and validate payment transactions. Offline payments, on the other hand, can happen without any communication with a payment provider or a DLT. For that reason, are sometimes called point-to-point payments. This use case has traditionally been filled by cash. We are now getting into digital solutions that can fulfill this need. A unique feature of a physical cash transaction is that they can happen under any condition between 2 parties. When central banks explore CBDC, they often mention wanting to preserve the cash-like features of a CBDC. There have been some forms of offline payment that have been tested, such as I mentioned Visa Cash before, as well as some additional workarounds that have sprung up in the interim period. Some forms of offline payment traditionally will expose the payee to settlement risks, as the payee is not able to independently verify that the payer has sufficient funds to honor the payment. So to address this challenge, our OPS system relies on secure hardware to remove the settlement risk. This resembles the tamper-resistance property of physical cash that protects against double spending of money in absence of a payment provider. With OPS, when offline devices come back online, they sync with a server or a DLT to make the offline balances available online. For that reason, offline payments through OPS actually complement an online payment. I wanted to draw a distinction from a credit card transaction, which in the current world, from a user's perspective, can be offline, right? If I'm a user, I can simply present a debit card credential, but the merchant in that situation is typically online, connected to a card network. So for this reason, we consider a true offline payment to be dual offline, where both parties are offline with no connection to the larger network. So I will now describe OPS in the context of the 2-tier CBDC model I mentioned prior. We will imagine two different users, each having an account with a different bank. Our goal is to allow user 1 to send a payment to user 2 securely without either user communicating with their bank at the time of payment. OPS requires the sender phone to have secure hardware, which is already available on most smartphones. Secure hardware provides an isolated execution environment inside the phone that can store data and execute code securely. Such environments are designed in a way that makes it overwhelmingly difficult to tamper with the code and data stored on. This means that we can store funds on the secure hardware and issue payments that are digitally signed with the secure hardware secret key. User 2 can then verify the authenticity of the payment completely offline using the secure hardware certificate. Should also mention that OPS does not require user 2 to have secure hardware unless they are also wanting to further spend money offline. Therefore, secure hardware is only needed on the sender phone. We will later discuss how user 2 can collect an offline payment into a secure hardware if they have it and continue to spend offline. Before any offline payment can happen, user 1 needs to provision their secure wallet by obtaining a certificate and a special piece of code known as the OPS Trusted Application, or OPS-TA, from their bank. The certificate is essentially a set of digital signatures attesting that the secure hardware is authentic, and the issuing bank, as well as all intermediate CAs on the path back to the central bank, are also certified. The OPS-TA consists of a set of instructions deployed on the secure hardware within a secure enclave and executes the core functionalities of OPS, such as updating the user's offline balance. Wallet provisioning is a one-time setup that is performed after the user installs the OPS wallet app on their smartphone. Once the wallet is provisioned, the user needs to deposit funds into their wallet when they are online. Namely, the user requests the bank to deposit an amount of money, X, from their online balance stored at the bank into their offline balance stored in the secure hardware. The bank then responds with a signature showing that X was deducted from the user's online balance. The OPS-TA inside the secure hardware verifies the signature with the bank's public verification key and adds X to the offline balance stored in the trusted application. Now, when both users are offline, user 1 can initiate an offline payment by requesting user 2's address, which is essentially their public key. Then user 1 triggers their secure hardware by calling the OPS trusted application to securely deduct the payment from their balance and create a signed payment message. The payment message includes a number of data fields that are shown on the left, including the sender's certificate, the receiver's address, the payment amount, and a replay protection counter referred to as the index. This payment message is an important safeguard against double spending, as I'll mention later. Next, user 1 sends the payment message to user 2, who verifies the sender's signature and certificate and checks that the payment contains user 2's address as the recipient. If all checks pass, user 2 will accept the payment and store it on their phone. Note that by deducting the payment amount from the sender's offline balance, the secure hardware is essentially preventing double spending of that same amount. We'll discuss this in more detail later. Now, if user 2 wants to add the amount of the payment that they received offline from user 1 back to their online balance stored at the bank, then they can use the claim protocol to claim it back to their online balance at the bank. The bank will verify the validity of the payment by checking the signature and that it wasn't previously marked as spent using a payment log maintained at the bank. If all checks pass, the bank adds the amount of the payment to the user's online balance and adds the payment to the log. Now, imagine that user 2 also has secure hardware that is set up in a similar fashion to user 1. If user 2 wishes to make offline payments out of the money they previously received offline from user 1 without returning online, then they can invoke a special functionality of the OPS trusted application known as Collect. Collect adds the payment amount into their offline balance. This allows user 2 to spend the funds offline in exactly the same way user 1 made the first offline payment. However, just because we can allow for strings of offline payment does not mean that OPS users never need to go online. At least to ensure that payments meet the bank's policies and regulations, we require that OPS users periodically sync with their banks. For example, a bank may want to limit how much money a user can spend offline during a given amount of time. That amount of time offline is what we refer to as an epoch. In addition, during the daily sync process that occurs at the end of each epoch, a bank can blacklist someone's wallet if they suspect fraud. The frequency of online syncs and all the conditions set by it can be adjusted by the bank during each online sync process. So the online sync can feature dynamic conditions and dynamic adjustments made by the bank on an ongoing basis. These syncs can also be set at the central bank level as part of their governance function. So step 4 is withdrawal. If a user with a secure hardware wishes to move funds from their offline wallet back to their online wallet stored at the bank, then they can do so via the protocol called withdraw. This invokes the OPS trusted application withdraw function to deduct the funds from the secure hardware and return a message signed with the secure hardware's signing key. The user then forwards the signed withdraw message to the bank, who adds the funds to the user's online balance after verifying the signature and certificates. To protect against replay attacks by malicious intermediaries, such as a corrupt wallet application on the user's phone, both the secure hardware and the bank maintain monotonically increasing counters that are incremented after every round of communication between the two parties. Both parties include the latest value of these counters in their signed messages so that the receiver can verify the uniqueness and ordering of all messages according to their local counter, which is synchronized after every exchange. So protection against double spending. As I mentioned during the protocol flow, 2 measures in OPS protect users against offline double spending attacks: the secure hardware and the payment log. As shown on the left, a malicious wallet app may try to send copies of the same payment object to the same user to spend the same money twice. The payment log maintained by user 2's version of OPS will detect this attempt and drop the second object. On the right side, the malicious app attempts to send the same payment object to 2 different users, which in fact is not allowed as each payment message is signed by the sender's secure hardware, and the message includes the address of the actual recipient. When we looked at the payment message a few slides ago, recipient's address was part of that payment message. Both of these functions ensure double spending is not possible without having to go online and perform any checks on a server. So, in summary, our OPS provides offline payments without imposing extra liability on users or banks. Currently, we're building a prototype of OPS on top of the Global Platform API, a standardized secure hardware model used in most Android smartphones today. We've also initiated conversations with additional secure hardware providers to evaluate the extent of the work should OPS get deployed on a smartphone provisioned by them. In addition to the smartphone version I described today, we have also tested OPS working on an EMV chip card with success. This extension of form factors greatly expands the potential use cases of offline payment. However, with the expansion of form factors, there is some reduction in functionality provided. For example, EMV chip cards cannot store as extensive of a payment log as a smartphone, requiring truncation and refresh of this log as part of the daily sync process. We're also actively working on extensions to the basic OPS design. I mentioned before that OPS resembles physical cash in the digital world. However, OPS is actually stronger than cash in some ways. For example, we've built a variant that allows users to recover their offline funds in case of a device loss. We're also working on a variant of OPS that allows attaching conditions to offline payments, an important step towards programmable money. For example, we have tested a scenario that resembles a food assistance benefit being spent offline. We can restrict offline payment only to certain merchants relying on their merchant category code or a similar signifier. This capability opens up offline payment to the world of programmability required by central banks. In this way, offline funds can inherit principles of programmability of online funds to preserve a central bank or a commercial bank's governance functions. In addition, OPS has an option to interact with additional standard cryptocurrencies, effectively allowing for offline crypto. This initial exploration has been done with CBDC use cases, but offline crypto is a possibility as long as a similar PKI infrastructure and smart contracts can be utilized. Finally, we're building mechanisms through which OPS transactions can become hidden to the bank even when the user claims payments online. And we are also studying ways to perform compliance checks on devices without connecting to a remote server. This would hopefully allow us to audit payments both during offline sessions as well as when the user's wallet goes online during periodic syncs. This would allow us to preserve privacy of the users while still allowing for auditability and AML functions to occur. This area is under research currently. I'll now show a demo of our OPS research implementation in action using a DLT smart contract. I will show both a pull and push payment flow using NFC between two phones, making sure you can see the video window, correct? Okay, great. In this example, our OPS is running on an Ethereum testnet that has an OPS smart contract deployed used to lock funds during the duration of the epoch during which the phones are offline. So our demo begins with two phones that are both being registered for offline payment. This step is what I described before of wallet provisioning. In this step, the offline secure wallets are provisioned by obtaining the certificate and OPS trusted application, or OPSTA, from their respective banks. The certificates are the digital signatures attesting that the full PKI certificates are certified. Upon the wallets being provisioned, we are presented with the main account screens for the CBDC wallet. User 1 chooses to move money offline using the deposit workflow. As this process involves locking funds to a smart contract, it is dependent on the infrastructure selected for the CBDC in question. The different consensus mechanisms available vary greatly in how long they take to confirm a transaction. As block times are often 10 seconds or longer, the blockchain deposit takes a while to confirm. Upon money being moved offline, user 2 can request offline CBDC from user 1 using a pull payment. The pull payment is accomplished by one NFC touch that requests the amount from user 1, and then a second NFC touch to confirm the payment. This is a security feature to prevent fraudulent payments that could occur with just one touch. Next, we'll demonstrate a push payment of user 1 sending $3 of offline CBDC to user 2. This is accomplished with the same two-touch NFC process as the pull payment. Finally, user 2 selects to move the offline funds received from user 1 back to their online balance using the withdraw workflow. As this step involves settling the appropriate funds in the blockchain, there is again a lag while the block is confirmed with the settlement amounts. This demo does demonstrate some inherent latency when using public blockchains. This latency can be overcome with alternate infrastructure focused on high throughput and/or scaling for speed. Okay, so based on Visa's history and experience in exploring offline payment, we have a number of controls recommendations to ensure that offline payment systems are kept safe. As offline payment systems do present some inherent risks, we offer a number of risk mitigations. First, we have a number of security considerations and controls. We support taking advantage of the most advanced hardware in the market while also balancing for availability. We feel that the most secure setups involve both hardware security devices coupled with software and governance controls. Hardware security is not typically enough on its own. Second, multiple form factors should be made available to cover multiple scenarios. As I mentioned before, we have tested OPS on both smartphones and EMV chip cards. We feel that both offer benefits in terms of availability and features. For example, the smartphone deployment can offer features for device recovery that the EMV card would not. In addition, as central banks consider rolling out their CBDC implementations, we suggest the following governance controls. First, a daily sync process and certificate refresh. This limits any bad actor in terms of damage. Requiring a fresh certificate every day allows for intermediate CAs to identify any devices that have tampered with the devices and blacklist them. In addition to that, we recommend max transaction amounts per offline period and max transaction amounts per transaction as further damage control features. These also limit the amount users can lose if they lose their device. Finally, we have some overall offline payment recommendations for central banks considering enabling offline payment. First, the two-tier model. Central banks should set standards for offline payment and allow the commercial bank layer to implement. Central bank should have an ongoing role in governance. In addition to that, we do have some alternatives to consider in addition to offline payments. We feel that offline payments should be reserved for the situations that truly require them. So there are some alternatives to consider where only one party may be offline or one leg of the transaction may be offline. First, queuing of transactions until merchants can return online for authorization of funds. This can be implemented for transactions that are not time sensitive, such as recurring payments or subscriptions, or if there's some level of trust between users that have a business relationship. In this queuing of transactions, settlement risk is the largest problem. Second, stand-in processing by a payment processor can mitigate instances where an issuing bank is offline. Payment infrastructure around the world is quite robust and high availability today, so it is becoming increasingly rare where both parties are truly offline. Some instances of outages can be mitigated by allowing a processor or a card network to process on behalf of the issuer. Finally, we feel there is a lot of promise being shown by SMS messaging and USSD solutions to cover low data scenarios. We've recently seen examples in Nigeria with eNaira solutions using this technology. Ultimately, we feel that offline payment is possible, can be done securely in line with how cash payments are done today, but should be reserved for scenarios that truly necessitate the functionality that can't be served by an alternate online method. So this concludes my deep dive into Visa's offline payment system research. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. I'll lead off with some questions for you, and this one that just popped up in Pigeonhole. That looks, this one was on my mind too. How will daily sync work in the case of a natural disaster or similar scenario that can knock people offline for an extended period of time? And I'm thinking my question was going to be like, what's the typical length of that epoch that means the time during which you can use the thing offline without going online, because you can't predict. It could be in a scenario where everything's knocked out for a day, or it could be a week, who knows? So could you elaborate on that, please?
Sure. I mean, the daily sync process is a lever that the central bank can pull to adjust their implementation of CBDC. It's kind of hard to plan for that in advance, obviously, with a natural disaster, but it's possible that that epoch of time could be adjusted based on the scenario from one day to a week. In addition to that, there are some alternatives that can be used, such as the distribution of an EMV card in the event of a disaster, right? So, as we mentioned before, offline payment can be implemented using a chip card. Those can be initiated by a central party, by the central bank, or by one of the intermediate CDAs, and then distribute those cards for offline payment during that period of time. So it's likely that your typical offline payment system may need to be adjusted in examples of natural disaster.
Then how would your solution work for, say, there's some scenarios where offline, you have to be offline maybe almost forever, like not forever, but really like I'm thinking of an area to develop in poor country where there's no infrastructure at all. So you're supplying this offline CBDC to them. Is it possible to run your platform with a virtually unlimited epoch?
Again, yeah, I mean, the epoch is adjustable by the central bank. If the decision is made that the availability of funds for offline is balanced against the potential for someone being sophisticated enough to hack their device, then that's a decision that the central bank can make. So again, I mean, these are parameters that are adjustable. We recommend taking a measured approach here. There's also alternate methods by which you could receive that certificate refresh. You don't necessarily have to have Wi-Fi at home to refresh your certificate. You could maybe go to a merchant in town that does have an online system to receive that certificate refresh.
Okay. Another question from me to you actually was you also mentioned that you're working on a potential way of recovering lost wallets. Can you kind of give a high level view of how that would work?
So that's still a research area. I think that's something that we need to build out over the next number of months. But it's a device recovery scenario in which there is a length of time by which, if the funds that were taken offline are not brought back online by another user with their payment log, then over a period of time, about a week or so, there's a decent justification for recovering an amount of money to a certain user. So it's kind of the aggregate of other data that's coming into the system to determine that, the amount of money that was left on the phone when it was lost.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. Lauren, do you have any views on that particular scenario?
So recovery is definitely a tough part. I'm really curious about the solution you have, Stuart. I must admit that it doesn't look really accurate to me. If you wait some amount of time, what guarantee do you have that someone has still an unclaimed payment and would like to maybe defund it later on? So this is, to me, something that could be accepted by a bank, but you're taking a risk, right? You're taking the risk that someone could not actually get his payment defunded. So I understand the difficulty for recovery. Nobody likes losing cash. Here, indeed, if let's say we lose the card, it's difficult to have accurate mirror of the offline balance that we would have. However, I'm just wondering, is it better to have an inaccurate solution, or shall we actually just say, if you lose your card, you lose your cash? And maybe the only difference with the cash would be that nobody could actually respend it except you. So to me, until I don't have any accurate solution, I'm not seeing that working really. But again, to be discussed more with Stuart, maybe I missed something.
I mean, as I mentioned, this is still a research area and something I think we can provide more information on in the future, as it's something that is requested, right? This is a common maybe not a requirement, but it is a request, from central banks and their list of features that they're looking for, some form of funds recovery. I think you're right. I mean, a central bank can make that proclamation that if you lose your device, then your funds are lost. But we are, wanting to explore the possibility of enabling that if it is possible.
When I've been asked that question, I've often described that the scenario where you can lose your wallet is actually a feature rather than a problem, because if the idea is to enforce it as truly digital cash, I mean, it'll be yet another layer of AML CFT compliance control, because you might have limits on how much you can hold in your wallet, but suppose you somehow crack that. Well, still, how much do you want to actually put at risk on this wallet? Do you want to have your whole life savings sitting on this wallet that could be destroyed or lost? So, but like you say, maybe some central banks do they wanted something more than this digital cash. They're looking for sort of more like a central bank savings account, perhaps. That'd be a policy decision. Okay, I've got a question for Lauren. Well, I think you covered this earlier. I think I told them that it was on slide 19, but maybe we need to revisit this. How does Bob's wallet know which is a legitimate emitter?
Well, in this solution, it's really simple. The key pair that was generated by the offline wallet of Bob needs to be attested. In other words, needs to be signed by the central bank. It's a bit similar from my understanding of Stuart's solution. When you need to have a certificate, use that certificate. So certificate is just containing a pair a key pair, and you use the key to actually sign Bob's wallet key pair. So this is your only guarantee that this wallet is not just a key pair that anyone has generated.
I would agree with that from our side of the implementation. It's that path of certificates back to the central bank that lets you know it's a legitimate user.
And the slide 19 was actually to add this anti-replay feature on top of the fact that you check this is the legitimate emitter. So it's more related to anti-replay.
Okay, and this is a question for both of you. I'll direct to Stuart first. What's the difference between EMV and NFC chip card? Is there any NFC chip standard on blockchain transactions yet?
So at least in our solution, the NFC is the communication method that we use between the two phones. NFC is also used to power the EMV card, in an offline, off-powered scenario. So I wouldn't say, as I'm aware, that there's an NFC chip card standard, unless Lauren, if you can, if you have more information on that one.
I'm just puzzled by the second question. So the link between the blockchain and the NFC chip, if you consider indeed that the NFC chip is the way that you use your chip to actually communicate information, to me, NFC is a standard and the blockchain is a specification. So I'm having difficulties to understand the link between both. Maybe if you can just re-ask the question differently, that would be helpful for me.
Whoever asked that question, they want to just pitch that into the pigeonhole. A few minutes, a minute. Meanwhile, I think we can say that there's not a lot of questions here, which I think tells us that your presentations were very, very complete. I certainly thought so.
Let's hope so.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think there was a question in the Q&A box too about, I think it was directed to Stuart, and I think I know the answer. You can't share your presentation, right? I think that's what you said. If someone's asking, can I have a presentation?
Yeah, not at this time.
And this session has been recorded, so after the fact, people can come back onto the page on which the agenda is, and there'll be a link to a YouTube. So that's going to be, that's almost better because what you say is actually more than what's on the slide. So I think that's all they should really need. Okay, well, I think that does it for now. Thanks, Lauren and Stuart, for those great presentations, and thanks for the audience engagement out there. This is actually the last session of the whole DC3 conference, so I'm very, very happy to be the guy that closes it out, and I think you can probably look forward to there being another one. This is the second annual one. There'll be a third annual one, hopefully, and we'll be able to give you further updates to the work of the CBDC architecture group that I'm leading. And also I'd like to invite all the participants here that the DC3 is a very, very open and inclusive organization. So all of you out there are welcome to join in and participate and contribute to the various projects. So you can just go to the ITU DC3 page and put in your contact details and so on. And you can be part of the club. And that's about it. So I look forward to next year, and I hope to be run into you, Stuart and Lauren, as this CBDC project trundles on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Take care.
All right. Thanks. Bye.